Hey, you sister students. Today we're going to talk about two presidents, Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. So let's start with the election of 1992. In 1992, you have Bill Clinton, who's the Democrat. He challenges George H.W. Bush, the Republican. Remember, H.W. Bush was Ronald Reagan's vice president, and then he won his own term as president. And now, in 1992, H.W. Bush is running for re-election against Bill Clinton. And we have a third party enter, the Reform Party. Ross Perot is on the ticket. This party takes votes away from George H.W. Bush, which partially hurts H.W. Bush and leads to Clinton winning the election in 1992. So the Democrats take control in 1992. A major domestic policy of the Clinton administration is trying to work for universal health care. And so the Clinton administration promised to fight for guaranteed health care for all Americans, and he appointed his wife Hillary to head a task force on health care. And so they brought forth lots of different plans for health care, but Congress did not pass any health care reforms at this time. The 1990s under President Clinton was also a time of economic recovery. So Clinton brought down military spending because the Cold War had come to an end, so we're closing down old Cold War bases. And by the time of the end of his presidency, the economy was enjoying its best time of any point in history. And in 1999, Clinton balanced the national budget. So the national budget went down to $0. We're $0 in debt in 1999. Going back to 1994, there's a midterm election. On the off years where there's not a presidential election, it's called a midterm election. And the midterm election, it's 1994. In 92, Clinton had just won the presidency, so the Democrats took control of the White House. And in 94, the Republicans come up with what's known as the Contract with America. So led by a guy named Newt Gingrich, and the Republicans, they wrote up a document. They called it the Contract with America. It's basically a promise of what they would do if they were elected. They're promising the American people what they're going to do if they elect them, the Republicans, into the majority of the House of Representatives. Here are some of the things that the Contract with America said. So first, it would require that all laws that apply to the rest of the country also apply to Congress. So they're not going to create laws that apply to the people but not themselves. Second, they're going to bring in a major auditing firm to check out where all the money goes, make sure that Congress is not wasting any money or there's no fraud or abuse being committed with the money that they're given to take care of. They're going to cut the number of House committees. They're going to cut committee staff, so they're going to save money that way. They're going to cut down on government. They're going to limit the terms of committee chairs. They're going to require that meetings be open to the public, so no secret meetings of committees. And they're going to require a 3/5 majority to pass tax increases. So you can't tax Americans more without having 3/5 majority of Congress approve it. And then guaranteeing honest accounting and trying to implement a zero-based line budgeting. So trying to only spend the money we have, not going into debt, basically. So no debt right here. That's what they're promising. All right. So Contract with America, these are things that the people like to hear. And it helps the Republicans win a majority in the House in 1994, the Contract with America. All right, now Clinton's impeachment and scandal. So what happened was an independent prosecutor basically uncovered an affair that Clinton had with a White House intern. And basically, Clinton was under oath, and he was asked about this affair, and he lied about it. He said that he did not have an affair, did not have any relations with the White House intern. And so when it came out that he had lied while he was under oath and was sworn to tell the truth, the House of Representatives impeached him. Now, what this means is the House of Representatives determined that he should go on trial for his actions of high crimes against the country or whatever. And so that's a formal accusation by the House. Now, the president doesn't get kicked out of office unless the Senate convicts him by a 2/3 majority vote. And so the House impeached him. So here, Clinton is impeached. That just means he has to go on trial. So he goes on trial in the Senate. The Senate hears it. The Senate did not convict. So the Senate did not convict, and so he stayed in office. During the Clinton administration, there's also turmoil in the Balkans, in a part of Europe, southern Europe, Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Kosovo. Basically, Yugoslavia is a country that was formed with many different ethnic groups. And these ethnic groups did not get along, and they're constantly fighting each other. So Yugoslavia dissolved, but they were still fighting between the groups. And so basically the fighting was between Christian Serbs and Muslim citizens in Bosnia and Kosovo. So Christian Serbs were massacring and trying to wipe out Muslim citizens in Kosovo. And so Clinton sent in U.S. airstrikes. He sent in peace negotiators into Bosnia, sent in military to Kosovo to try to stop the violence, stop the massacring, and help find peace in the region. Okay, so that's Clinton, his involvement in Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Kosovo. Okay, next I want to show you a few people from all different races, walks of life that have achieved the American dream. The first person is Bill Gates. He co-founded the company Microsoft. And today Microsoft software is part of nearly every personal computer in the world, making Bill Gates a very wealthy individual. Next is Sam Walton. You've probably heard of Walmart. Well, he started a little store in Arkansas called Walmart, turned it into a franchise, and also Sam's Club. And now Walmart is all across the country, huge store, huge business, and the Walton family is very wealthy. The next is Estee Lauder. She was Jewish. She was from New York. She founded a cosmetics makeup company called Estee Lauder. You've probably heard of it. Basically, they achieved their early success through word of mouth, and then invested in larger marketing later and just took Estee Lauder really big, and now it's a well-known cosmetics company in the United States, and she became very wealthy through that company. Next is Robert Johnson. He's the first African-American billionaire. He got his money by founding Black Entertainment Television, and he sold that in 1998 and made $1.5 billion. In 2003, he bought and became owner of the Charlotte Bobcats. Next is Lionel Sosa. So he founded the largest Hispanic advertising agency in the United States, and he was a political consultant. So he worked for Republican presidents to try to help gain Hispanic votes through his advertising to the Hispanic community. And he was very wealthy through his advertising agency, and he worked notably with Reagan and H.W. Bush and President George W. Bush. So that was the Clinton presidency. Next we have a new election. So Bill Clinton ran 2 terms, 92 to 2000. In 2000 we have an election. The 2000 election was very close, the closest contest in history. It's between George Bush and Al Gore. So George Bush is the Republican, Al Gore the Democrat. And basically the Democrats were slightly weakened because of Clinton's scandal, and there's also a third-party candidate, Ralph Nader, entering the race that kind of sucked votes from the Democrats. Gore actually won the popular vote. He won more votes than Bush did, but Bush won the Electoral College. And so it's who wins the Electoral College that wins, not the popular vote. Basically, it came down to Florida, the state of Florida. Whoever won Florida was going to win. Bush won Florida by less than 1,000 votes. And there was lots of question regarding the accuracy of the ballots and who the people were actually voting for. And so they called it for Bush. Gore sued, and so Bush v. Gore made its way to the Florida Supreme Court. Florida Supreme Court said we're going to recount the state of Florida. So they start recounting. Then it makes it all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court halted the recount and said that the recounters should not have to determine voter intent. That wouldn't be fair for them to be looking at a ballot and say, oh, well, I think they probably meant to vote for Gore, but it looks like they voted for Bush. So the Supreme Court said they shouldn't have to do that, and so they called it for Bush, and Bush wins the election of 2000. One of President George W. Bush's big domestic policies is called No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind was an educational policy. It required that the states test students in English and math every year from 3rd to 8th grade to make sure that they were proficient and they were progressing in math. This was trying to make sure that all students are receiving a quality education through standardized testing. They're trying to monitor that. The major domestic and foreign policy that consumed the George W. Bush presidency happened because of terrorism on September 11th of 2001. Basically, what happened was there was Islamic fundamentalist terrorists. They boarded airline planes and flew those planes. They hijacked them and flew them into several different targets. The two World Trade Center buildings in New York City, the Pentagon, and the fourth plane was headed, we think, towards the White House, but the passengers overtook that plane and it crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. The leader of the attacks were Osama bin Laden and the organization Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden took shelter in Afghanistan by a group known as the Taliban. So you got to know the difference between these two groups. The Al-Qaeda is a worldwide Islamic terrorist organization. They recruit from around the world. They commit strikes against Western countries. The Taliban is going to be an Afghanistan country, or Afghanistan party, Islamic fundamentalist party that rules the government in Afghanistan. So Taliban is just Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda is worldwide. The attacks on 9/11 set off a global war on terror. We're going to fight countries that are aiding terrorists, that are helping terrorists in any way through money or shelter or whatever. And so the United States sent forces into Afghanistan to take down the Taliban because they were helping Al-Qaeda there. The U.S. government created the TSA to try to make air travel more secure. So they look for anything suspicious. They check your luggage. They check people before they board airplanes. And then President Bush also created the Department of Homeland Security. So this is a cabinet position. Now we have a director or chairperson of the Department of Homeland Security, and they work to keep the U.S. safe from any threats here at home. And then the President and Congress passed the Patriot Act of 2001, which gave the government more law enforcement power, where they could conduct searches, they could monitor people's bank accounts, they could detain immigrants. It just gave them a lot more power to fight terrorism, was the Patriot Act of 2001. Now, a lot of people felt like the Patriot Act was not good. It had gone too far. It threatened people's individual liberties because the government could spy on you, could monitor your bank account, could detain you without a whole lot of reason. And so people weren't in favor, a lot of people weren't in favor of this, but a lot of people were as well. And the war on terror, the United States government used a base in Cuba called Guantanamo Bay. Now, this was a U.S. military base that was not on U.S. soil. And so if terrorists were captured, they were sent to Guantanamo Bay, where they were not given rights that Americans have because they weren't on American soil. They did use different torture techniques to try to gain information, such as waterboarding, which is now the U.S. government is no longer using. But the government was doing whatever they could do to try to get information to try to stop terrorist attacks against the United States. Another country that President Bush was afraid was going to aid and help terrorists was Iraq. And so the U.S. got involved in a war in Iraq because they feared that the leader, Saddam Hussein, right here, who was the leader, was going to provide biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons to terrorists. And the United States did not want terrorists to get their hands on any of these things. Now, Hussein says that he didn't have any of these weapons, but each time that the UN, the United Nations inspectors, tried to come in and look and check, he didn't allow them to. And so it made it look like he was hiding something. And so the U.S. told Saddam Hussein that he needed to surrender its weapons, or he would face, and his country would face invasion by the United States. So he refused to cooperate, and in 2003, March of 2003, the U.S. and its allies invaded Iraq and took down Saddam Hussein. Now, the war in Iraq began with airstrikes, using planes, bombings. But early April 2003, the U.S. forces entered Baghdad, which is the capital, and Hussein's regime and government collapsed, and Hussein was captured. He was put on trial in Iraq for crimes against Iraqi citizens, and he was hanged in 2006. So the U.S. and its allies, now they control the government of Iraq. They set up a democratic government. They elect leaders to write a constitution, and Iraq becomes the first Arab democracy in the Middle East. Now, all that seems very good and very like it was successful, but there was still lots of fighting, still is to this day, still problems in Iraq. The Democratic government is still facing opposition. There's still those in Iraq that believe that the U.S. shouldn't have entered and that they want to take over the government and run it how the way they see fit. And so still lots of issues in Iraq. A lot of the problems that the U.S. faced in Iraq is that former supporters of Hussein, they're still fighting. So even though Hussein's gone, his people are still fighting against the U.S. There are Shiite Muslims that are fighting against any foreign involvement in their country. And in Iraq, there's 3 different groups that all don't really get along. You've got Sunni Muslims, Shiite Muslims, and Kurds. And so you've got not only Iraqis fighting Americans, you've got Iraqis fighting Iraqis. And so it's a pretty big mess in Iraq. It was much more involved than the U.S. thought it was going to be from the beginning. The major domestic issue that President George W. Bush faced was in 2005, Hurricane Katrina. So this was a hurricane that hit New Orleans, Louisiana. 80% of New Orleans and other areas on the Gulf Coast was hit and had to be evacuated. The surge and the waves of Katrina were exceeded the design of the New Orleans levee. Now, a levee is basically an embankment that's raised up to try to keep a river from overflowing. And so if you can see this map down here, you've got the levees that are A and B here holding back water. So this is the Mississippi River over here. This is Lake Pontchartrain and the shoreline. And the reason why New Orleans flooded is because the levees broke down and allowed floodwater into New Orleans. It wasn't the hurricane necessarily that created all the problems and the flooding, all the rain that was associated with the hurricane. It was the levee broke down and the river flooded into the city. Hurricane Katrina was a huge hurricane. It was the costliest hurricane on record. 1,800 people were killed. The damage it was done by the levees not being able to hold back the water. Tons of people were displaced and moved out of New Orleans and out of the Gulf Coast region. So it was a huge mess that was faced by George W. Bush. And then the last issue of his presidency was the financial crisis of 08 and 09. So this is the worst crisis since the Great Depression. The cause of this was stock market started falling sharply in 2000. So when the stock market started falling in 2000, the government lowered interest rates to try to stimulate the economy. We're going to make it cheaper to borrow money, make it easier to borrow money. So people will borrow money, get the economy going. So people took advantage of these low rates. They bought homes. And home loans were given to people that couldn't afford a new home. And so they couldn't make their payments back. So houses were built, which dropped prices. People had mortgages with adjustable rates. They're called ARMs, adjustable rate mortgages. And these rates went up and the people couldn't afford their payments anymore. People that probably shouldn't have been given loans in the first place because they couldn't afford the homes that they were buying. And so they had to be foreclosed on, and so the housing market just crashed. There was foreclosures everywhere, and that led to an overall problem with the economy. One thing that did happen in 2008, the president created the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act, which allowed the Secretary of the Treasury to buy bad investments and fund banks so they wouldn't collapse. So we're going to give money to banks. We're going to buy up bad investments. The government's going to eat these bad investments. So that the banks and big businesses aren't going bankrupt and falling apart and killing the economy.